Hello, this is Georgina Rose and welcome back to the Dato YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to mysticism, magic, religion, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. And this video is part of my long-running and flagship series on this channel, Occult 101. I've been doing this series since my very first video. It's not every video on this channel, but I do them pretty frequently, and if you want to watch more of these, there's actually a playlist on my channel of all of them. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a topic that I think sounds a lot edgier and darker and scarier and maybe even evil than it actually is, and that is magic related to death. And a little bit about the very polarizing term necromancy. Now, I want to get this out of the way first because I think this is the number one misconception people have related to this topic. And that is that this topic inherently belongs to a left-hand path, or as I prefer the term, antinomian path of religiosity, right? That doing this stuff is dark, it's sinister, it's only part of traditions that are very on the edgy side of things, right? That is actually a complete lie. In fact, every single religious tradition interacts with death in some way, including the basic folk practices that you've probably been doing for your entire life, but just haven't realized actually fall under the category of magic. It is actually one of the most essential parts of human religiosity because humans are fundamentally fascinated by the dead and death because it is one of the great unknowns in life, right? Most of our lives, we know the path, right? We know you go to school, you graduate, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you grow old, your kids have kids, you become a grandma, you pass down your wisdom. And what happens after that is something that is a big question, right? Because everyone who's watching this video, I would assume, unless they have YouTube in the world after this, is alive. There are people who have near-death experiences, and some of them report specific afterlives that they saw, but generally it's something we don't know about. And that is why it's so essential to human ritual practice, as well as mystics and occultists. We are always trying to go down this path, this journey towards a purification of the heart and a unification of the soul with the divine and the completion of the alchemical great work. The thing is, it is impossible to fully annihilate yourself into the divine while you are on this planet. There is a piece of Apocrypha that was accepted by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church called the Book of Enoch, which tells the story of a man named Enoch who is given the complete knowledge of the universe. And when he is given the complete knowledge of the universe, he is taken from this earth to heaven. Now, some argue this means he died, some argue this means that he was literally just taken from earth to somewhere higher, but basically the moral is if you understand everything about all the secrets, you will no longer exist. There's a specific term in Westernism called the epistemists, which is a sort of term for the highest level of achievement and adepthood in the mystical world, and that actually is situated on the Sephirah spear of Gether, the absolute crown of the tree of life. And many have argued that it is impossible to reach this level of attainment while you are still alive. So, as mystics, we are fascinated by death because, in a sense, we are bettering ourselves so that when we go to what is beyond this world, we are going to what is beyond this world in a better state. I wrote an essay on my Substack recently of why we shouldn't fear death as mystics, which I would really recommend reading. It kind of elaborates on these topics. But generally, people are fascinated by it. And the way that people interact with the dead is a big part of religious expression. So we're going to get into all the ways that this happens. Let's get into it. So I think the most obvious way people think of interacting with the dead and people who have passed away is through the idea of a seance. So a seance is when a group of people get together, they sit around a table, and they call spirits into that space. This idea really comes from a movement out of the magical revival. The magical revival was a time in history during the mid to late Victorian and the early Edwardian period in Europe. I specifically know the most about what was happening in the United Kingdom because a lot of ceremonial lodge magic that is practiced by modern Western occultists does originate from this period. But there was a lot of activity at this time. This is when Thelema started. This is when Golden Dawn style Hermeticism, which is the Hermeticism most people first encounter, comes from. This is where Theosophy, which would lead to the New Thought and then the New Age movement, all sort of genesis here. As well, other movements like Wicca are a direct consequence of this period of time. And one big thing during this period of time was spiritualism. So spiritualism was a specific spiritual movement that was related to conjuring and communing with the dead. This was done typically through big parties where people would gather around tables and host seances. Now, there are multiple techniques for how this was done. Some would use a person who was essentially kind of a mediator or a channeler, and the spirit would flow through that person. Some people would use things called pendulums. Nowadays, people associate pendulums with like new age, new witchcraft type divination, where you hold the pendulum between your fingers. I don't have one on hand. There's one in one of my drawers somewhere. And you just kind of like see which direction it swings, and whatever direction it swings is your future. But that tool was actually not invented for that. In fact, that tool was meant to be used over a board called a pendulum board, where you hold it in your hand and the board has different things labeled on it, and whatever way it swings, it being swung in the air by the presence of whatever spirit it is, that would be your reading. This is also the predecessor to the idea of the Ouija board, which has been immortalized by Hollywood cinema. Now, I actually, as a mystic, do not recommend people use Ouija boards. Why? It's not because I think communing with spirits is bad. In fact, most of what I do is communing with spirits. Theurgy, or the practice of divine magic, is just that. It is communing with spirits, interacting with them, letting them flow through you. And this was central to the magic of the Platonists and the Neoplatonists, who would actually shape Christian mysticism when Europe converted from paganism over to Christianity. The problem with Ouija boards is that they're essentially spiritomegal. You don't know what you're gonna get. It's calling in anything random. And interestingly, this is where there's a bit of a divide from what the spiritualists did, because a lot of the spiritualists would focus on specific things and call specific spirits. But no, not inherently bad. I just think it's a waste of your time. I think there are better mystical practices to engage in. Now, you also get around this period people trying to channel specific dead relatives or past figures. You'll see people with these little like metal prong wand looking things where they hold two of them and the metal kind of moves back and forth and they try to read from it and decipher from it. But while this is really kind of a product of that period of time, the idea of communing with specific dead ancestors actually goes way, way back and is crucial to the entire concept of ancestor veneration. Now, ancestor veneration can go in several different directions. I've spoken about it before. I have a video on the entire thing, but basically people honoring their past dead. This could be a single dead family member or a sort of collective idea, like the collective ancestry of your people or of your religion or of your craft or whatever it is, right? Or you could literally be calling out specific ancestors. You will see in some traditions, people will make altars to their past relatives. For me, I have a photo of one of my dead relatives on my altar that sits there as a sort of honoring type thing. And you'll see from this, people, of course, literally trying to communicate with them, but also people interact with the dead. And yes, this does actually count as interacting with the dead spiritually in a softer capacity, like giving offerings to them. And this actually leads us to a broader conversation about honoring the dead and the idea that specific members of the dead have a sort of spiritual power to them and that they can impact your life. Now, there was a funny example, and this is actually what prompted me to make this video on Twitter, where there was a group of Chinese students in China. They had a sort of like grave of sorts set up for Sir Isaac Newton, who, you know, did a lot of like math, physics, science type stuff. Okay, I'm not a science channel. I'm not going to explain that part of it. But people were leaving him apples to get good test scores. And people were calling that like a very funny thing. Like, oh, is this like a new folk deity? Is this a new folk religion? Or haha, this is just a weird thing that people are doing so zany, so wacky. And I remember looking at that and I was like, well, there's actually a really huge historical precedence for people doing stuff like this. In fact, if you look at all sorts of religions, people call up specific people who they think are sacred in some way to get them to intercede. So I don't see why this would be illogical. As well, one thing that comes across these traditions is the idea that these specific important deceased people may have specific epithets or rulerships that they have sway over. This appears in a number of religions. The practice of saint intercession in Catholicism and Orthodoxy and other sort of high churches of Christianity does fall in this category, because what the Christians believe is that these saints can intercede under God. Now, the saints themselves are not gods. In fact, what you do is you ask the saint to pray for you for God, and since the saint is passed on, the saint can then intercede unto God. And before a spirit becomes a saint, right before they are given that title, they actually have to perform several miracles that then have to be fact-checked by the church itself. So you get actually, even outside of the category of saints, a lot of people who are debatably saints and are venerated by a lot of different Catholics who they believe can intercede and do these things. These people are often, you know, very religious, very holy people, and often they do have miracles that relate around certain things. As well, if you look to Islam, those who are Sufis have a list of sort of Sufi saints who they will deal with on a religious level. There's one specific type of Sufism that I think takes this to a bit of a further extreme. called the Barelvis, who are a specific sect of Sufis. And what they believe is this idea of the Nur Muhammadiyya, or the light of Muhammad. So what they do is they invoke Muhammad himself, and they believe through the light of Muhammad, you are then saved, which is an interesting idea because Muhammad is not a Messiah, Muhammad's not a God, Muhammad is a prophet in that religion. So that's an interesting dead invocation as well. You will also see, if you look to Shia Islam, you will see the veneration of specific imams with big shrines to them. There's one specific guy, Imam Hussein, who was a martyr in Islamic history. He was killed by early Sunni Muslims very brutally, and he has been venerated for a very long time by these people. In fact, when there are wars related to this stuff or famous warriors, they will often say that they might have like prayed to Hussein before or been, sort of benefited metaphysically from Hussein himself. So that's a very interesting tradition there. Now, if we look at more pagan traditions, you will see some specific like neo-pagan tendencies or modern like occulty movements getting into this type of idea. Thelema specifically has a list of Gnostic saints, though that technically does not fall under like Thelema. It falls under the EGC, or the Gnostic Catholic Church, underneath Thelema, but that is once again like a list of saints, so to speak, who can be venerated. I've also noticed that some people who are more syncretic pagans will sort of pray to specific figures. I've seen it done with Plato, as Plato is of course one of the most righteous pagans from history, right? He's a very famous Hellenic pagan who then would inspire really the entirety of Western philosophy, who I've seen people do similar behaviors with. As well, within pagan culture specifically, you will see a heavy influence on venerating the ancestors, having the ancestors intercede as a collective. Now that is once again working with the dead. This idea of collective dead is an interesting one, and it's essentially the idea that if you have enough ancestors sort of come together and compact into what is somewhat like a deity. This is very present in African traditional religions, where you will see like whole deities that are really just a collective of ancestors brought together and sort of turned into a deity itself. This is where the idea of ancestor worship as a term gets thrown around. When I talk about ancestor work, I tend to always use the word veneration, and that is specific because people don't generally literally worship their ancestors, like they don't think their ancestors are gods, but there are some traditions where it does get a little close to this. Often when we're talking about these dead figures, we are talking about them in a veneration context, right? These people are also venerating gods, and they don't see them as these ancestors as the highest spirit of the highest spirits, but there always are outliers. Now, there are specific grimoires and occult practices that relate to ancestors and dead figures in a more direct sense, and in a sense that I was sort of getting at the beginning of the video, and that is practices that actually literally claim the term necromancy. Now, the term necromancy is probably one of those polarizing terms in religion because it is actually condemned and banned in pretty much every single religion. But what's interesting is all these religions do still do things with dead loved ones, dead figures, dead Buddhas, dead saints, right? So where does this idea come in? Where are we starting with the necromancy conversation? I would say that begins, and I really only apply this term to specific grimoires that claim it for themselves, right? There is no tradition where people are trying to bring back the dead literally to physicality. If that exists, I am not aware of it, and it is not something that is practiced enough to have ever come up on my radar. I'm sure someone has tried it, right? For every crazy idea, someone has tried it, right? People try things metaphysically that don't make sense all the time, but that really doesn't exist. But there are practices where people will invoke or evoke actual dead people ritualistically. Now, this is a little bit kind of like that Nur Muhammadiyya idea, because that is an invocation, but this is more extreme, right? For those who are unaware of these terms, invocation is when you call a spirit into you. Evocation is when you call on a higher spirit into you and then use the higher spirit to command that spirit to be outside of you. Invocation, internal; evocation, external. And there's one specific grimoire that actually does this that I think everyone's gonna point at the most, and that is the Book of Saint Cyprian, which is a incredibly polarizing grimoire, super polarizing stuff. So Cyprian was a person. He was a saint who was a former sorcerer. He was a pagan sorcerer, and he converted to Catholicism very famously, but when he converted, he actually kept a lot of his magical practices in it. And this document has become so polarizing, with some claiming the authorship is illegitimate and someone else wrote this, but it talks extensively about using the dead themselves to create talismans, to do divination, to do all sorts of things. And there are invocations and evocations of the dead. this is the text that most embodies the idea of necromancy that people are talking about. What's so funny about this text to me is the people who gravitate towards it are one of two camps. It's either Catholics or it's like the edgiest of the edgy people. Because the edgiest of the edgy people are obviously interested in necromancy because it sounds, term goes hard. And this is still, I once want to remind this, a Christian grimoire. This reminds me a lot of the conversation I was having recently about the Shams al-Ma'arif, which is an Islamic grimoire that is super, super polarizing in Islam. A famous Islamic scholar declared it to be devil worship. This guy, Ibn Taymiyyah, who I dislike for every single theological reason possible. I think his theology is super horrible. I think he's probably the worst of his school. But anyways, he condemned this text. And so this text, even though it was originally written as a Sufi mysticism text, picked up this big reputation of edginess. And so now the people who approach the Shams al-Ma'arif are not really the Shams al-Ma'arif's target demographic. It's like very edgy people interested in this stuff. And I think Cyprian kind of gets a similar boat to it, because when I look at Cyprian, I've read it, right? There's copies of it, you can get it, you know what I mean? It's not hard to get a copy of. It reminds me a lot of the Keys of Solomon, but it has taken on such an edgy connotation that people, when they go to use it, if they are these left-hand path types, they get really annoyed when they realize how Abrahamic and Christian it is. Like, guys, it's a Christian text. A lot of Christians are going to condemn this text. A lot of people say it's bad, it's fake, it's, evil. So that's a discretion for you to decide, but if anything does fit that category, we gotta give it to this text. The final way to interact with the dead in a magical and mystical way that I want to address, and this is one that I don't see people talk about ever, is the idea of working with specific gods that are related to this subject to connect with the dead. So this is really for people who have dead loved ones or who have an immense fear of death. This is for you guys. And this is the idea of venerating a psychopomp deity. So a psychopomp deity is one who can go from plane to plane in their mythology. A most common example is Hecate. Hecate is a psychopomp. Hecate in her myths is constantly going up and down the realms. Hecate often gets sort of like written off as a witchcraft goddess because that epithet of hers is very popular due to the witchy boom that we had over the past decade that I think has kind of died out. But she also is a psychopomp. So for people who want to connect to their dead in that sense and want to sort of transgress the realms, she will be one to go with. Now, the other type of god you can work with to deal with these topics are gods who are literal death gods, right? There's a lot of gods, there's one in every single religion where their epithet is death. But I find what's interesting about them is to look at what their other epithets are, right? Hades, right? Hades is a god of death, but he is also the king of his realm, of Hades, the underworld, of where the dead reside. So there's a kingship to him that's going to color your experiences. Now, another death god is the goddess Manat from pre-Islamic Arabia. Manat also does not just rule death, but she also rules fate. It is believed that she sort of threads fate together. And in fact, based on archaeological records and the records of what we have of the people of that time, she is the oldest goddess that was ever venerated. So what's interesting is if you look at a goddess like her, there's a primordial tendency that underlie them that you're not going to see with other death gods and goddesses. So this all is going to be something you consider. As well, Saturn comes up a lot. Saturn is, of course, an astrological body, but there is a deity attached to Saturn. That would be Saturnus or Kronos for the Greek equivalency. And that is the titan that rules death, karma, discipline, boundaries, all sorts of stuff. And so if you were to say venerate Saturn, there would be a lot of other implications besides death itself. So working with these gods, be very careful about one you choose. Death gods are heavy. They're not evil. They're not the devil. Like, that's not what I'm getting at. There are evil spirits who do fit that role, who you should say 8 million light years away from. But these spirits are heavy. They're hard. And if you are struggling with the idea of death or with ones who have passed, that could be a way to go. I lied. There is one final thing I want to bring up because it just entered my mind and I think it's an interesting thing to discuss. And that would be if you have recently had someone die, the best thing you can do for them is to leave offerings to them, to pray for them, and to hope that whatever happens to them after this realm is positive. So if you are in that situation, that is what you should do. I think there is a fundamental ethical conversation that goes along with these topics of where is the line, right? Because the reason why necromancy has broadly been banned, whereas venerating the dead, leaving offerings to the dead, praying for the dead, praying for their intercession even is considered different, is because there is this idea of rest and peace that you should apply to those who have passed on. So all that's important to consider. I think where you stand on this topic and where the line for you is a conversation you need to have with yourself. I personally do not do Cyprianic type stuff. Out of what I think is ethically right for my path. I'm a little right-hand path though. It might be too right-hand path for you. So think about where you fall in this continuum. And, you know, this idea of death, it's something that is part of life, right? Life is a cycle. We live, we die, we are born. Life, death, and rebirth, as Jung eloquently put it, is the cycle of life. So this should all be something you consider. And best of luck with your path. I thought this would be a fitting video to release right around Samhain. This should come out before Samhain because that is a holiday that is so related to death and people are doing so many practices revolving the dead. So this stuff isn't intimidating. Just say some prayers and leave out some offerings if you want to start, or perhaps you might look at something a little bit more complicated. So that's all I have to talk about in this video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. If you ring the bell and are subscribed and all that for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel and you never have to think about death again until it comes for you. You can find me on all platforms. I'm here on YouTube. I'm on Twitter, Twitch, Telegram, Substack, Instagram, Twitter. I don't know. I'm really everywhere. It's all linked below. You can support me through Patreon. You get an extra video every month, early access to all my videos. If you're a high enough tier, you can get to meet with me once a month and I can give you personalized spiritual advice and mentoring. And you also get access to my Telegram group chat, which is a really fun chat where we talk about these subjects all the time. And you can ask me questions whenever you want. So if you have a pressing question, just let me know. Thank you guys so much and I'll see you in the next one. All right, bye.